Okay, hello and welcome back to Principles of Micro with James Bland. Today we're going to learn a bit about what imposing a tax on buyers will do. So to begin with, let's have a think about the flow of goods and money in a market just between one buyer and a seller. Okay, so whenever a trade happens in the market, there is a buyer and a seller. And if there is a mutually beneficial trade, then the seller will pass on the good to the buyer, and the buyer will send the seller some money, which in our supply and demand diagram would be P dollars. Okay. Now, this is what happens when the government is not involved, but if the government is imposing taxes on the buyer's side of the market, then this is essentially passing a law that says for every item that is sold, right, so for every item that goes from the seller to the buyer has to send a tax, a value of the tax, to the government. Okay, so if the tax is T dollars per item, then we've got this other entity over here called the government, and the buyer has to send T dollars to the government. Okay. You can think about this for example, if you are buying things in the US, suppose you show up to a store and you see something advertised at a price is equal to $10. Okay, and so then you walk up to the register, and the person at the register says, well, no, that's not $10. You're actually going to pay P plus some tax, which might be something in the order of, say, $10.80. So, that's assuming that we have 8% tax. And of that money, $10 goes to the seller, and 80 cents goes to the government. Okay, but as a buyer now, the number that you're really paying attention to isn't this initial $10. You don't really care about the sticker price. What you care about is how much money you have to give up to get the good. And so what you really care about now is $10.80. And so what we're going to arrive at here is that the thing buyers are going to pay attention to is this thing called the price. I say buyers and consumers almost interchangeably here. Price consumers pay, which is sometimes denoted as PC. Okay, so that's the number that they're going to be paying attention to. When there isn't a tax, this thing is just equal to the price in the market. But when there is a tax, the price that consumers pay isn't going to be equal to the price that sellers receive. And therefore, we need to work out what buyers are going to do based on this price consumers pay. So let's work out what this tax on buyers does to the demand curve. Okay, so here is our set of axes, and here is a demand curve. Now remember from chapter 4 of ManQ, we came up with we derived a few different interpretations of the demand curve. I mean, firstly, there's getting this from a demand schedule. As price goes down, people typically want to buy less stuff. So if we pick a price here, the demand curve is going to tell us how much stuff consumer wants to buy. So let's call this quantity 1 and price 1. But another interpretation of the demand curve is that it tells us that the marginal value of a particular unit is measured by the height of the demand curve. Okay, so you can think about this as there's a consumer, sitting on this part of the demand curve who has that marginal value, and they're going to buy if they can pay less than P1, let's say less than or equal to, and not buy otherwise. Okay. But let's think about this if we leave the demand curve here, but instead call this marginal value. Then if the government imposes a tax on buyers, buying this good now comes with an obligation to send money to the government. Okay? So, if, for example, the government imposes a $1 tax on an item that makes me $10 worth of happy, right? My marginal value, let's write this down. So suppose my marginal value for an item is $10, right? If I'm going to buy that item without a tax, that means that I'm paying less than $10 for it. So suppose I pay $7 for it, and so I am 10 minus $7, which is $3 better off than not having bought it. Okay, but now suppose that there's a tax which is equal to $2. $2. Okay, so now my marginal value is equal to $10. I pay $7 to the seller, and I also send $2 to the government. So now I am $10 minus the $7 I pay to the seller, minus another $2 I have to send to the government. So this is now only $1 better off. Okay. So the number that I need to pay attention to here, the price that sellers pay, in this example, is $9. Okay, so what this means is that my marginal value incorporating the value of the tax that I have to send to the government has now decreased by the value of the tax. So if before buying the item made me, say, $20 better off, and now there is a tax of, say, $3, then I am now, $3 worse off than had I not paid the tax. So my demand curve should be somewhere down here. Well, it should be exactly there, right? This is the value of the tax. So this means that the demand curve is going to shift down. That was rubbish. The demand curve, slightly less rubbish, is going to shift down by the value of the tax. Again, imagine these are parallel lines. Okay, so we can think about this as for every quantity here, consumers now get less value out of buying the good because buying the good now comes with an obligation to send some tax to the government. Okay, this shift you could also think about as a shift to the left, as in if this good now comes with this characteristic that I don't like, right, this obligation to send money to the government, then I'm going to do less buying if prices don't change. Okay, that's the horizontal shift story. But Mathematically, I think this makes more sense to think about it as a shift down, because the demand curve is now shifting down by the value of the tax. Okay, so now we're going to take this new understanding of what happens when we tax the buyer's side of the market and put it into our supply and demand diagram. Okay, so here we are. Let's put in a supply curve and a demand curve. And we're going to impose a tax on buyers. This means that the demand curve, in terms of marginal value, is going to shift down by the value of the tax. So we can think about this as D minus the value of the tax. Okay, so what's happened here? We have, go to a third color here to make it make sense. We have our original equilibrium here. So here's our Q1 and our P1. And our new equilibrium, which is going to be the intersection of the supply curve, well, nothing's happened to sellers here, and the demand curve. So we've got our new Q2 and our P2. And so here we can see that quantity has gone down. Okay, this good has become less attractive to buyers. It now comes with an obligation to send money to the government, and, all else held equal, that's money that they don't have to spend on other things. Okay, so this good has become less attractive because it has this obligation to send money to the government. Okay, but now we need to be careful about working out who's receiving and paying what amounts of money. Okay, so we've worked out that consumers, let's work out what's happening to sellers at the moment. Well, if this is the quantity being traded, it must be that sellers are receiving this much. So this is the price that sellers receive. I'll write that out. Price that sellers receive. Okay. But consumers aren't paying that much, right? Otherwise, they'd be buying a lot more stuff. Right? They are paying this plus the tax. So consumers are paying this amount up here, which is the price consumers receive. Consumers pay. And so what we have here is that the price consumers pay must be equal to the price sellers receive plus the tax. Okay, if you were watching my previous video, I would have shown you a similar equation, which was the price sellers receive. This is when we impose a tax on the seller's side instead, is equal to the price consumers pay minus the tax, which can just be worked out by moving the tax over to the other side of the equation. Just to finish up here, to work out what situations these people are in now after the tax, well, the price sellers receive after the tax is less than the original equilibrium price. So sellers receiving lower prices, that's not good for them. And price consumers pay is greater than the initial price without the tax, and so that's not good for them either. Okay, so the tax on the buyer's side is, qualitatively at least, and we'll get to quantitatively in my next video, having exactly the same effect on quantity and the prices that buyers and sellers are paying and receiving respectively. Okay, I'm James Bland. I'll see you later. Bye.